I think most of you have heard about trigger warnings. The big issue on university campuses these days are trigger warnings. And these are warnings that are placed atop of reading material, or a teacher will preface the material saying there's a trigger warning for the students, that the material that follows may be unsettling to your emotional balance. That gives students an opportunity to listen or to read, or to decide, wait a minute, right now it's not for me. There's also, just kind of linked with the trigger warnings, is a program on university campuses where they developed safe spaces. And many of you may have heard of this. Safe spaces are places on the campuses that have been developed where people who have felt in one way or another marginalized, and that is LGBT, or people who've suffered trauma, people of color, women, perhaps in some circumstances, they can go to these safe places, safe spaces on campus, and feel that they are being treated with respect, and there they treat others with respect, regardless of their vulnerabilities and sensitivities. And all of this has arisen because of the heightened sensitivity, I would say, for diversity, and the recognition that different people have different vulnerabilities, different sensitivities, and they need to all be respected. That's how it's arisen. It's created huge controversies on campuses, really huge. And big issues are things like, hey, wait a minute, aren't the universities supposed to be open and free speech? And a lot of people are objecting to this idea of trigger warnings. And some people are calling the students of this generation coddled. I've heard them called the orchid generation, being so baffled that by the time the question arises, by the time they come into quote-unquote real life, everything is real life, let us understand. But the time they get out in the world away from the university, they won't know how to handle it. That's what some people say. And then others observe that, oh, wait a minute, the donors, the alumni mainly, by and large is a good sentiment against trigger warnings amongst donors, and donations have dropped, which some rather cynically suggest this is causing the university administration to suggest, whoops, maybe trigger warnings aren't such a good idea. So the big controversy going on. Now, I don't intend to talk about the pros and the cons of trigger warnings on campuses, but I would like to talk about it in terms of the Dharma, the Buddha's teaching called the Dharma, because it occurred to me that a big trigger warning should be issued with regard to the Dharma. And that is the trigger warning that the Dharma will be upsetting to your perspective. And I'll say that, trigger warnings on campus are the Dharma, the material that follows may be or might be upsetting, depending on the individual. I'm saying, with regard to the Dharma, it will be, guaranteed. There's just no question. If you're practicing right. If you're kind of blowing it off and maybe just sitting there and not listening, well, maybe you get by. But if you're listening, it's going to be upsetting. It will upset your perspective, not just one time, but a lot of times as you keep on practicing. There's a Zen saying, or at least a saying at Shasta Abbey, where I lived for a while, it's a Zen monastery. It said, it's good to be bothered by the truth. This was a good thing. So it's going to happen, and I'm sure I know that it has happened for many of you, many times probably. This isn't, I will say, the talking about the fact that the Dharma is upsetting isn't usually how we talk about it, right? I mean, we don't usually approach it that way, but I think it's an important perspective for us to realize, important dimension for us to realize. It occurred to me as I was developing this that the poet Robert Frost once wrote, "Something there is that doesn't love a wall." And I thought, with regard to the Dharma, to the contrary, something there is within us that does love a wall. We love walls. We love to feel like we are safe behind a wall, that the wall is keeping out our enemies. And I needn't mention a particular presidential candidate who's suggesting that we construct one between us and Mexico. Walls, they make us feel safe, right? They make us feel safe. Phil, what am I doing wrong here? Let me take off my glasses first. Yes. This is being recorded, by the way. Oh, well. Okay, how is that? Better? We'll assume without the glasses it'll be better. So for us, I think that we do love walls. There's something in us that really feels much more protected by them, and we feel vulnerable if the wall is down. And I remember, again, going back to Shasta Abbey, when I was living there was at one point when I was talking to some monk, and I was explaining to him that something had just happened. I don't remember what it was, but I do remember that I said, it felt like the rug had been pulled out from under me. And to my surprise, he said, "Good." He said, "The rug should be pulled out often." And I remembered it, as you can see. I mean, these years later, I still remember that comment. And he was right. He was right. That's what happens with the teaching. The rug is pulled out from under you. Now, mindfulness, a centerpiece of our training, of our practice. Mindfulness means seeing things as they really are, as you know. And it isn't a belief about the truth of things. Mindfulness is a stripping away of belief in order to see what is really there. A stripping away of beliefs. It's not putting an overlay of our likes and our dislikes and our sense of what's important and not on what's happening, but stripping away so we can truly see it, what's going on. And we often talk about this here at IMCC. And I think you all deeply understand that principle, or most of you really understand the principle. But the practice, for all of us, it's challenging. It's an ongoing practice. How do we embody that? How do we really, really embody mindfulness? And it's about the hardest work that I think anybody can do, because it involves being aware of what's really, really going on within us, and that's often a hard thing to be aware of. Now, when we talk about the Buddhist teaching, the Dharma, I think we talk about leaning in, or what the Buddha called investigation of what's going on. Investigation is one of the 5 faculties, as he called it, one of the 5 qualities that we need to be aware of if we're going to work toward awakening. We need to investigate. We need to lean into what's true, even when it's painful, especially when it's painful. Investigate and really notice. So that's quite the opposite from the trigger warning and how it operates on campus. But there's some wisdom to the trigger warning in safe spaces if we take a look at the context of spirituality. And in addition to leaning in, to investigating what's happening, we need to be compassionate to ourselves and know that there are times when we must not lean in. Time to get away. Time to simply do what? Go to your own safe space. Take a walk. Knit, whatever you knit, or play with the computer, whatever it is that gives you ease, so that we can come back and lean in again and really lean in. So all of this, the Buddha called clear comprehension. That is, how do we truly comprehend what it is we need to do when? Do we lean in and investigate? Or is it time to just pull back and be compassionate? It calls for a great deal of maturity, really, doesn't it? A balance, what, when. There's no one rule, and only we. And as we develop in our practice, we become more mature in the practice. Only we can determine what's needed and when. Now, all of this is about the Dharma, so far, as I've been talking, the Dharma on our everyday level. I will say it is our practice, the groundwork of our practice. It's what's fundamental. We can't get along without it. We need to do it. But it's so easy to lose perspective as we practice. It's easy to lose perspective and really get kind of lost right in that practice because there's no end to it. There's always investigating. There's always times when it may be time to back off. And we can begin to think that's the whole of it, but it's not. And the Buddha said time and again, the goal, or the Zen people would say the goalless goal of the Dharma is freedom. It's freedom. Buddha had many different words for freedom, and among others he called it the unfarmed, the unconditioned, the end, the truth, peace, the blessed, the refuge. All of these he used to describe finally what his teaching was about. And I think it's important not to lose sight of the freedom aspect. Even though we may feel we're far from it, it's not that, oh, well, I'll think about it later when I get closer. No, holding it in mind because it transforms what your practice is about if you do. So what I want to talk about here and now is about awakening. Because it is through awakening that it leads to freedom. And I'll read you a poem that I think is really powerful about awakening, and it's by Juan Ramon Jimenez. It's called Oceans. And he wrote, I have a feeling that my boat has struck down there in the depths against a great thing, and nothing happens. Nothing. Silence, waves. Nothing happens? Or has everything happened? And now we are standing quietly in a new life. It's a quiet poem, isn't it? You know, no big, huge punchline or whatever. Profound. It's awakening. He's talking about awakening. And on the level of the ultimate, in fact, nothing does happen. Ever. That's it. Nothing happens. But on the level of our everyday life, when that is experienced, the awakening, something profound happens. And what happens is a shift in identity. Not that we have shifted. A shift has happened in identity. And there's a realization that you are not only what you thought or who you thought you were. Now, awakening happens in two basic patterns, and I think all of us have heard about that at one time or another. Two basic patterns. There's a gradual awakening, and there's sudden awakenings. And there are many different ways in which these two patterns come together, the gradual and the sudden. And there's no telling how it's going to unfold for you. And there's no right and there's no wrong. Gradual, sudden, some of both, whatever. A gradual awakening is when your practice involves a series of little openings, kind of progressive. And they keep continuing, they keep happening. And I know that's happened for many, many of us. It's almost intrinsic to our practice. Openings, like, aha, right, I see that. And I hadn't seen it before. You see it here and you see it there. And I've heard the image used before. It's like if you had a big black piece of paper, it's like construction paper, that was in front of your view. And each little opening is a pinhole. And another one, and another one, and another one. Suddenly, there's so many pinholes, there's light coming through. Awakening. That's the gradual awakening. It's progressive. We call these little pinholes, in our tradition, insights, a direct experience of truth. Shunryu Suzuki, who was a Zen practitioner, called them, spoke of them, and he said, there are 1,000 little moments that make one dance, the insights. And I just heard someone else, just in fact last night, saying, a little slice of joy. Oh, that was lovely, a little slice of joy. That's what happens with these insights, these pinholes, the little bits of light that begin coming through, and we see in a new way until eventually, wow, it's there. This is an awakening. Again, Shasta Abbey, they talk about being covered like mist. It happens gradually over time. There's this one, just gradually. Sometimes we hardly even notice it can be so gradual, but it's all going toward awakening. Then there's another, I'll say, kind of awakening, and that is sudden awakening. And here I'm going to discuss this sudden awakening in terms of my experience, because that's the one I know best. And I'll say, when I was young, I was in my early 20s, and I know some of you already know this story. I was in my senior year in the university, and I was a philosophy major. And I didn't meditate. I had no teacher. I had no information about Eastern philosophy. I had no background at all, no context. And yet I knew that for months early on, something was, I would say, building up. There was something building, and that it felt like it was coming after me. During my senior year, I didn't know what it was. I didn't talk to anybody about it. But I will just say that on one night, it caught me, and everything kind of burst open. It utterly burst open. In that moment, or moments, I don't know, maybe it was moments when it did burst open. I'll say everything stopped. Everything stopped. There was no time. There was no nothing. The world was just, it was just silence. It was whole. It was complete. Afterwards, and not during it, but afterwards, when I contemplated it, I realized, you know what? There was no sense of a me there. I mean, I was conscious, but I wasn't there. I mean, the Susan as I knew wasn't there. And what to say? It can't really be said in words, except I will say the effect of it most certainly can be said in words. And I will say that as a result of those moments, everything that I knew was wiped away. Everything I thought. I don't mean that I became, forgot how to speak. I mean, the world as I knew it wasn't what I thought it was. Now, you can imagine how devastating this is to someone who was a philosophy major and thought she in my senior year, for heaven's sakes, I thought I should know something. And I realized I didn't. They had it all wrong. Now, I'm not going to say every philosopher had it all wrong, but I wasn't in on the inside of what most philosophers were saying. No, I won't say that. I wasn't in on what those philosophers who truly had understood it were saying. And I will also say, most Western philosophers don't have a clue. Most Western philosophers in the Western tradition are talking from up here. Maybe profound intellectual structures. It's not this. So at any rate, everything in those moments changed. And it was a grief. For me, it was really a grief. And I will say that I knew deeply. There was so much that I knew but couldn't articulate as a result. And so I could say I knew, but I didn't know. It took me decades to live into this. Really, decades. I'm still doing it, by the way. I mean, this is an ongoing process. It's not like you pull over the curb and you got it. It doesn't happen like that. So it's still ongoing, and it takes your breath away. Now, I will say that for myself, I actually had 2 awakenings. The second happened 20 years after that. It's not just, at first I thought you only allotted 1 per lifetime. That's what at the beginning, when this happened, 1 awakening a lifetime. And then, by golly, I experienced it when life said to me 20 years later, that. But I'm not the only one. I was reading, there's a poem by Jane Hirschfield, poet. I don't remember which poem it is. She had 3 awakenings. And I know that there are other I'm talking sudden awakenings here, these big ones. And I know there are others who knows how many they had. And in a way, it doesn't matter. This isn't a matter of racking up more awakenings. Not at all. But it's just that this is such a stunning shift in consciousness that can happen. It is a transformation. And I'd like, in this part of the talk now, to talk about characteristics of awakenings, of the experience of awakening. What I understand as the characteristics, and first of all, that an awakening is profoundly upsetting, or can be. I just said, trigger warning, Dharma will upset your perspective. And we understand that pretty readily, I think, on the everyday dual level, relative level. But on this other level, it is profoundly upsetting because all of a sudden it flips you into another level of consciousness. And so it's so easy to think, oh, awakening, what bliss, how wonderful, to get all kind of rosy about it. And that's not what happened for me. It upset all my apple carts. It was tremendously upsetting, and after it happened, and it went on from, I will say the insights kept rolling in for months, and I felt, and these were the terms I used for myself, I felt like before that my life was kind of severed in two, and beforehand everything was black and white, and afterwards it was in color. These are the terms I used at that time. Or I thought of myself like I was a newborn chick or a raw egg. Those were kind of my terms at the time. So, and this is just a description. I will say that a few months afterwards, it just all felt too much to even bear. I just couldn't bear all of this newness coming in and everything being other than I thought. And for a while, I actually considered suicide. And as you can see, it didn't happen. I decided to slog through it all, and I did. But transformation just isn't easy. The writer Rebecca Solnit writes about caterpillars. And she points out that when caterpillars are in the chrysalis, what happens is that they liquefy. They liquefy before they become a butterfly. It's an utter transformation. And the teacher Adyashanti, whom some of you know, Westerner, he talks about this in can be very humorous, incredibly insightful and humorous. And so he kind of put himself in the place of a caterpillar who was in the chrysalis and said, uh-oh, this isn't what I had in mind. It says the caterpillar beginning to undergo this transformation. And then Adyashanti says, caterpillars don't want to be butterflies. They want to be flying caterpillars. I mean, I'm not doing justice to how funny it was, but yeah, I think you get the point. Who wants to kind of lose themselves? They don't. We don't. And there are accounts of other people who've experienced sudden awakenings. I'm thinking of Eckhart Tolle, who said he sat on a park bench for 2 years. And I've read others, people who rode around in a bus for months, just to get their bearings straight. So I say this not to scare you. And I'll say certainly when it happened to me the first time, I didn't have a clue what was going on and no context, no one to turn to. It was so terrifying. It was really terrifying. But not for you. For us in here now, we have believe me, when I was young, there weren't many people who knew. That was a long time ago. There weren't that many people who knew about this. Now there are all kinds of people who know about this. You have a context. You can turn to people. You can read about it. It makes a world of difference. When I felt like I was alone on the planet, you're not. So one characteristic of awakening is that it is profoundly upsetting. Another characteristic, I think we can consider in terms of getting lost. Usually here at IMCC we talk about letting go or surrendering sometimes. But I think a better term is getting lost. you do get lost when you awaken. You're suddenly thrust into new territory. You just don't know where you are. And it kind of wipes out what you did know. So, continuing my story, the night that happened, when I was in my early 20s, I was alone in the house at the time. It was evening, and I was sitting and thinking about something upsetting that had happened earlier in the day. But I can say, in retrospect, I had no idea then, but in retrospect, I was ripe for this. I didn't know. But that particular day, after months of something that I felt like was coming after me, that particular day and that particular incident that happened that day that was so upsetting kind of broke whatever needed to be broken through, and the awakening happened. I know when I went upstairs to my room after that happened, I was utterly aware. I knew that I was a stranger to that room. I mean, I'd been in that room for years, and all of a sudden I knew it, but I didn't know it at all. I didn't know anything at all. And it felt to me like it was the stranger, but I was the one who had shifted. And the next morning when I woke, same thing. It was spring, and I heard a bird outside. And it was the saddest thing I ever heard. The beautiful, most profound and poignant and saddest. It was utterly, again, it was new. So I would just say that I felt as the insights kept rolling in, another image I used was feeling like you've seen rolling pins? I don't know if rolling pins are still used, but how they flatten dough. That's what I felt. I was being rolled and flattened under a piece of dough under a rolling pin. It was just that much, that big. So that was the year I graduated as an undergrad, and having been a philosophy major, I realized that the philosophy didn't tell me anything about this. I just didn't know. And so in protest, I didn't go to my graduation. And when I was sent my diploma in the mail, I took it didn't march over, but I made an appointment. I saw the chancellor, and I told him that my education had been a waste of time, and I gave him back my degree, my diploma. So, I was so intent. I just thought I give him back my diploma. I was giving him back my degree, and it took me a while to realize. Wait a minute, he has the diploma, but I've still got the degree to my name. I may as well go back and get the diploma, which I did. I went and got the diploma back, but the break had happened. I just realized I felt the whole Western tradition had abandoned or not really supported me. It just didn't support with what was possible. So, in short, I felt lost. Getting lost, better than letting go. I will say that another characteristic of awakening is an openness, or even might say a willingness to be lost. And I'd like to explain what I meant, because I think we all need an anchoring. We all deeply want anchoring in our daily life. We want control. We want to know what's happening when, right? I mean, how many of us don't want to know? We do, and it's very natural. And I think when I said an openness to being lost, what it really expresses as we want control, but even more deeply, I think that many of us feel this yearning, this call for the sacred mystery. There's something that is so deep that we can't put words to, and that is this yearning for sacred mystery. And I know I had that, you have that. Well, obviously, evidently, in me, it was pretty strong in my 20s. And I will say that openness to being lost, I wasn't aware of that. It was exactly the opposite for me when this thing was after me in my senior year. I tried to run away from it, basically. I could feel it like coming after me. And I tried like crazy to get away from it. It felt like it was going to kill me, which it did, in a way. That was the paradox of it. The old me. I tried to get away, and I fought, and it caught me anyway. And years later, I read a poem that just described this beautifully, and it's a poem called The Hound of Heaven by Francis Thompson. I think he's a 19th century poet, if I'm not wrong. He said, I fled him down the nights and down the days. I fled him down the arches of the years. I fled him down the labyrinthine ways of my own mind. And in the midst of tears, I hid from him, and under running laughter. And that, when I read that, I said, wow, that was it. Somebody else, and he just got it. So that was, I think, the openness to being lost is a yearning, expresses as a yearning, a deep yearning for sacred mystery. And finally, I think there's another characteristic, and I think that is the characteristic of confidence, our faith, our trust in this process. And it's something that happens only slowly. You don't, to my understanding, I don't think you have it right away. We want control, but over time, we can become more and more comfortable with being lost. On the external level, again, Rebecca Solnit, and she's written a book called A Field Guide to Getting Lost. She's talking about, quotes here a historian, and he was talking about 19th century explorers. And he said, his name was Aaron Sachs, he said, explorers were always lost because they'd never been to these places before. They never expected to know exactly where they were. Yet at the same time, many of them knew their instruments pretty well and understood their trajectories with a reasonable degree of accuracy. Their most important skill, and this is the one I think is really critical here, their most important skill was simply a sense of optimism about surviving and finding a way. And Solnit points out, they had a readiness to deal with whatever came up. An orientation, a receptivity, and I think we can see that on a spiritual level is the point I'm getting to. We can have an openness, and it doesn't happen right away. As I said, I certainly didn't experience it that way. I wanted anything but that, but we can develop an openness to being lost, a receptivity to it, and it can happen at any time. And that receptivity or openness, the Buddha calls faith, saddha. That's the Pali word, saddha. Our confidence, our trust, all the same thing in this tradition. And that is to not know where you are, to have faith in this process, to have faith in the process. I can say that lots of things can happen almost at any time in our lives and throw us out of our usual circumstances. And they can indeed put us in a place where we're lost momentarily. And that can be wonderful. And I will just give you one little example I rather recently experienced. And it happened in the middle of the night. It was last year. The heat pump at my house had just been replaced. And it was kind of cold. Heat flipped on. And in the middle of the night, I woke up and I was smelling something really funny. And I thought, wow, I was afraid the house was on fire. And I kind of got out of bed and went all around and sniffed. And then there's an apartment in the basement, and everything was okay upstairs, apartment in the basement. I went downstairs, and I thought maybe she had left on, something, and there was a problem there. So I opened her door quietly, sniffed, and this is about 2:30 in the morning, and no problem there. So I went outside, greatly relieved, didn't know what was going on, but I was relieved. And I was standing outside. Here it was, 2:30, the street was absolutely quiet. I was totally outside of my usual pattern of things. And suddenly, everything just opened. And it was so wonderful. Spacious awareness. I just saw through to the spacious awareness. And being lost by circumstances thrown outside. And I'll say eventually, you don't even have to be lost. You can just be comfortable. It's just there because it's always there. And I'll just kind of jump to the very conclusion here and saying ultimately the Buddha talked about refuge, and we usually think when we talk about refuge as refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and we usually understand that on a very conventional level, and that's true. But it can also be understood on this other level. And when the Buddha spoke about refuge as freedom, It's not that we're going toward. It is that. It is the freedom right there in that moment. And being lost, you gradually begin to recognize that being lost, you get not only comfortable with it, but realize that's being home. That's what the Buddha was talking about. Oh, so we only understand it or experience it as being lost from our everyday point of view, because it is different from our conventional reality or what we think of as our everyday point of view. But it recognize eventually, this is it, this is home. And you can begin to take home back into conventional reality. I'm skipping here, but you begin to take home back into conventional reality. So as they say in Zen, it's not two, it's not one. Is this confusing? It is. But it's also true. You are under that, I'll say, we can lose touch with that awareness, but the awareness never is lost. Or we can feel lost when we are first experiencing it, but the awareness itself is never lost. That's reality. Reality always is. Reality never isn't. So while we may be out of touch, it isn't. And we can always, blink of an eye, heartbeat, right there. So I think I will stop here. We have 5 more minutes, and I just want to leave a few minutes for any kind of comments. So I thank you for listening. And any comments? Yes, Josie.
So did you ever find a connection between the Western teachings and the Eastern?
Sure, there are some, like Kierkegaard touches kind of on it. Yeah, there, of course. I have not found any, and I haven't really looked at Western philosophy in a systematic way for a long, long time. But at the time I was looking at, Kierkegaard did a bit. And there were a few others. I think Bergson did a little bit. Some others. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes, Linda?
Okay, the Hound of Heaven was explained to me, anyway.
Okay, speaking up.
I can talk a lot more.
Okay.
But I'm just sort of embarrassed about what
Oh, don't be embarrassed. This is all so much bigger than any one of us. It's fine.
Well, the Hound of Heaven that was in my English lit class, we read that, and I thought the teacher explained it. Well, I was at a Lutheran school, actually, so it was God chasing, or, the person. So as you talked, and I have that kind of background, not that I espouse that really much
No
anymore,
problem.
but I just thought of that and people's experience, quote, Christian people or religious people talk about, God, well, even Job, kept after him,
Right.
and then eventually. So when you were talking, so everything you said sounded wonderful, but I just don't have a clue exactly about what you meant, about this experience. I guess I obviously haven't had it. Although since I've been meditating, little things are shifting in my life, and it's over a period of several years, really, since I've been coming here. And I don't know if that's what you're talking about.
Gradually the
It's
awakening
gradual.
is that, yes.
Just that letting go.
Yeah.
But it's, anyway, I don't know what I want to ask. It's not like a religious thing, or it's nothing about God, or it's nothing. It's awareness of reality, I guess.
Yeah, and then we have to ask, what is God? Do we want to talk?
Yeah, that's a good question. Would you
Yes.
talk about that?
It is a good question.
Thank you.
But, there are many different, there are many different ways of talking about God, and some will point out that, you can call God or the sacred, or Allah, or Jehovah, or just all kinds of names, Jesus, and just spacious awareness. It depends upon the words. Finally, I think the words all point to the same nameless thing, which we as human beings have to put into words, but it is so great, it's so far beyond what we can say. So we put our beliefs onto it, and maybe some of us try to see past beliefs. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Anybody else have a question? Yes, Dan?
I've always really liked these Zen stories of sort of sudden kind of awakening.
Yes.
One that I liked in particular is in a book called, I think it's called Zen Mind. Soke An was like I think is his name, a Japanese monk who came to the U.S. in the early 20th century. And in that book, basically, he describes all of a sudden, and even in the book, the font is different where it writes zzz, and he says at that moment, he shifted from the subjective to the objective world. And then from then on, it was just, that's where he was. Does that sort of describe what you're talking about, something like that?
Yeah,
or?
it does. And yet, at the same, whether we call it subjective to objective or whatever, and it sounds like he had an awakening and never deviated. I mean, he was always there. Yeah, maybe they're confusing each other. He was always there. It sounds like others have been, like Ramana Maharshi, 16 years old, he had an awakening. That was it. Never deviated. Well, I can't say the truth from that same for myself. I love a distinction that Adyashanti makes. He talks about it abiding and not abiding, awakening. It's not that awakening never goes away, or the truth of it goes away. It's that we're not always in touch with it. And it sounds like the Zen master you're talking about was always in touch. But it's the same thing. It's all the same thing, just different manifestations of the same thing. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you. I know there are parts of practice that can seem technical or mundane or difficult, and it's just really nice to be able to be reminded of a larger perspective and kind of what it's all about.
Yeah.
So thank you.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. Yeah, we shouldn't forget that. Anybody else with one more question if anybody has it? Okay. Then I hope you all have a beautiful week.